The Duke of Blackwood smashed the ancient hourglass against the marble floor, but the sand didn't spill. It bled. As the crimson grains stained the white stone, every soul in the kingdom felt a sudden, agonizing thud in their chest. They had just lost another year. Mothers looked at their children and saw taller brows. Old men looked at their hands and saw deeper liver spots. And in the center of the palace, the Duke stood taller, his skin smoother, his eyes brighter. He wasn't just a ruler. He was a thief of time, and today, he had taken more than anyone could afford to lose. Alara felt the phantom weight of the lost year settle into her bones. She was a pianist, or she had been, until the Duke's tithe of time had stolen the suppleness from her joints. She stood in the back of the grand ballroom, hidden behind a pillar, watching the man who had aged her 10 years in the span of 5. Duke Alaric Thorne was a masterpiece of stolen vitality. He moved with a grace that felt predatory, his presence commandingly youthful while the lords and ladies around him withered like fallen leaves. The kingdom was dying, so he could remain eternal. The music stopped. The court pianist, a man who looked 80 but was likely barely 40, had collapsed over the keys, his trembling hands finally surrendering. The silence that followed was suffocating. Alaric's gaze swept the room, cold and expectant. He hated silence. He craved the beauty of the world he was slowly extinguishing. Does no one else possess the strength to entertain their liege? Alaric's voice was like velvet over gravel, rich and terrifyingly vibrant. Alara stepped out from the shadows. She didn't think, she moved. The desperation of a dying kingdom fueled her. If she was to lose her life year by year, she would at least look her executioner in the eye. She walked toward the grand piano, her ivory gown tattered at the hem, her mahogany hair pulled back in a fraying ribbon. The nobles gasped, their voices a papery rustle. "I will play, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. Alaric turned. For the first time in a decade, his expression shifted from boredom to sharp, lethal curiosity. He watched her sit, watched her gnarled fingers hover over the keys. He expected a dirge. He expected the fumbling of a broken woman. Instead, Alara played fire. She played the sound of a harvest being burned, the sound of a mother's first scream, the sound of a clock ticking toward midnight. It was a rebellion in G minor. She poured every lost year, every stolen breath, and every ounce of the kingdom's silent rage into the strings. The intensity was so great that a chandelier overhead began to vibrate, the crystal droplets weeping light onto the floor. Alaric didn't move. He stood frozen, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword, his eyes fixed on Alara's face. He saw the intensity of her soul, a fire that his tithe hadn't managed to dim. He saw a woman who wasn't afraid of him, even as she felt her own life slipping away with every measure. As the final, crashing chord echoed through the hall, Alara gasped, her vision blurring. She felt a sharp, icy pull in her soul. The tithe was reacting to her proximity to the source. She began to fall, her body finally betraying her. Before she hit the floor, Alaric was there. He caught her, his arms strong and terrifyingly warm. As he looked down at her, his shocked expression wasn't just from the music. It was from the ring on her finger, a signet he hadn't seen since the night his father was murdered. "Where?" he whispered, his grip tightening. "Did you get this?" Before she could answer, a black arrow hissed through the air, shattering the window and burying itself in the piano's wood, right where her head had been a second before. Alaric didn't hesitate. He pulled Alara behind the massive oak piano just as a second arrow splintered the lid, showering them in black lacquer and ivory shards. The ballroom, once a tomb of stunned silence, erupted into a cacophony of terror. Guards in iron-gray tabards flooded the room, their swords ringing as they drew steel, but they weren't looking for the assassin. They were looking at Alaric. "Get her to the library," Alaric commanded his captain, his voice cutting through the panic like a blade. He didn't look at the guards. His eyes were locked on the black fletching of the arrow embedded in the piano. It was marked with the sigil of the Order of the Hour, the very zealots who claimed the tithe was a curse they could break by spilling royal blood. "I can walk, Your Grace," Alara panted, her chest heaving. The proximity to Alaric was dizzying. Being near him felt like standing too close to a furnace. He radiated a terrifying level of stolen life. Yet, as he gripped her arm to steady her, his touch wasn't cruel. It was desperate. They sprinted through the vaulted corridors, the sound of retreating footsteps and clashing steel echoing behind them. Alaric led her not to the library, but to the restricted archive, a place where the air tasted of ancient dust and forgotten secrets. He slammed the heavy mahogany doors shut and bolted them. "The ring," Alaric demanded, his breath barely disturbed by the exertion. He loomed over her, the moonlight from the high windows carving his face into sharp, tragic angles. "My father wore that signet the night he was killed. It was supposed to be buried with him. Instead, the kingdom began to wither, and I was left with a crown that demands the lives of my people." Alara pulled her hand back, the obsidian stone catching the silver light. "My father was the royal clockmaker, Alaric. He didn't steal this. He was given it by your father to hide. He told me that as long as the phoenix remained in the dark, the kingdom had a chance. He died an old man at 32 because he refused to tell your inquisitors where it was." Alaric's mask of royal indifference cracked. He stumbled back, hitting the edge of a massive wooden desk. "My father gave it away? He told me the tithe was our only survival. He told me the sands of the hourglass were the only thing keeping the borders from collapsing into the void." "He lied to you to protect the power," Alara said, her courage flaring. She stepped into his space, her gnarled fingers reaching for the ancient letter she knew was hidden in the desk, a secret her father had whispered on his deathbed. She pressed a hidden catch on the desk side, and a drawer slid open with a groan. Inside lay a yellowed parchment, the wax seal unbroken. Alaric took the letter with trembling hands. As he broke the seal, the very shadows in the library seemed to lean in to listen. The letter wasn't a decree. It was a confession. The tithe wasn't a necessity of state. It was a blood pact made generations ago, and the Duke wasn't the master of time. He was its primary prisoner. Every year, he took shortened his own soul's tether, even as it polished his skin. "It says the pact can be broken," Alaric whispered, his flint-gray eyes scanning the faded ink. "But it requires a resonance of life, a harmony that has been lost." Suddenly, the floor beneath them shuddered. A low, rhythmic humming began to vibrate through the floorboards, coming from the direction of the music room. The secret room, Alara realized. The key of G minor. My song, it wasn't just music. It was a key. Before they could move, the library doors groaned under a heavy blow. The Order of the Hour had found them. The library doors splintered as a heavy axe bit through the ancient oak. Alaric's hand flew to his sword, but Alara grabbed his wrist, her touch a frantic plea. "Not with steel, Alaric. We cannot fight time with blood. Follow me." She led him toward the furthest corner of the archive, where the bookshelves met at a sharp, shadowed angle. Remembering her father's frantic sketches, she reached for a leather-bound volume that had no title. As she pulled it, the entire shelf groaned and swung inward, revealing a passage that smelled of cold stone and forgotten melodies. They scrambled through just as the library doors gave way, the shouts of the zealots echoing behind them like the baying of hounds. They descended a spiral staircase that seemed to hum beneath their feet. The air grew thicker, vibrating with a low, ethereal frequency that made the obsidian ring on Alara's finger pulse with a soft, rhythmic light. At the bottom, they emerged into a circular chamber draped in shadows and silver dust. This was the hidden royal music room, a place erased from every map of the palace. In the center sat a singular, ornate piano of white bone and silver wire. "My father called this the heart of the hourglass," Alaric whispered, his voice hushed with awe. He stepped toward the instrument, his reflection ghost-like in its polished surface. He said if it were ever played by the right soul, the gears of the world would reset. "I thought it was a fairy tale told to a grieving boy." "It's no tale," Alara said, approaching the keys. She saw a secret compartment beneath the keyboard, already partially open. Inside lay a cache of documents, the original contracts of the Blood Pact, signed in the ink of lives long gone. The tithe isn't just taking time, it's storing it. The piano is the reservoir, Alaric. You aren't just youthful because you've stolen years. You're youthful because the time is trapped within the royal line, unable to flow back to the people. Alaric looked at his hands, perfect, strong, and deeply, terribly wrong. Then I am the dam holding back the river of their lives. If the dam breaks, Alara, what happens to the water? It returns to where it belongs, she said softly. But you would face the weight of every year you've lived. You would age in an instant. The Duke closed his eyes, a look of profound vulnerability crossing his features. He wasn't the predator now. He was a man realizing the cost of his own existence. I have lived 1,000 years of other people's heartbeats. I am tired of being a beautiful statue in a graveyard. The sound of boots thundered on the stairs above. The order of the hour was close. Alaric drew his sword, not to fight, but to wedge it into the door's mechanism, buying them seconds. He turned to Alara, his eyes burning with a sudden, desperate hope. Play, Alara. Play the song that woke the stones. If I am to wither, let it be to the sound of your music. Alara sat at the white piano. Her fingers, still stiff from the tithe's touch, found the keys. She didn't play the fire of rebellion this time. She played the G minor of forgiveness. She played the sound of a father's lullaby, the rustle of a summer field, the quiet peace of an evening well-earned. As the music filled the room, the obsidian ring began to glow with a blinding light. The silver wires of the piano shimmered, and a low, resonant thrum shook the very foundations of the castle. Alaric stood beside her, his hand on the piano's lid, his body beginning to tremble as the stolen light within him started to leak toward the instrument. The music didn't just fill the room, it began to pull at the very fabric of reality. As Alara's fingers danced across the bone-white keys, the silver strings hummed a frequency that resonated with the hearts of every person in the kingdom. In the villages, in the fields, and in the dark corners of the city, people stopped. They felt a strange, cooling sensation in their chests, like a fever finally breaking. Inside the secret music room, the transformation was violent and beautiful. Wisps of golden light began to pour from Alaric's skin, drawn toward the piano like iron filings to a magnet. The stolen vitality he had carried for a decade was being siphoned away, not into another hourglass, but into the music itself. Alaric gasped, his knees hitting the dusty floor. Alara watched in heartbreak as the smooth lines of his face began to deepen. The unnatural perfection of his jaw softened. Fine lines branched out from the corners of his eyes like the delta of a dried river. His dark hair, once a solid, youthful black, began to shimmer with threads of distinguished silver. He was aging a decade in a matter of heartbeats, the weight of his true years finally catching up to him. "Don't stop," Alaric urged, his voice cracking, losing its velvet edge, and gaining the raspy wisdom of a man who had actually lived. He gripped the side of the piano, his knuckles turning white. He wasn't in pain. He was in a state of profound relief. The crushing burden of being a thief was lifting. Suddenly, the door to the music room splintered. The leader of the Order of the Hour, a man consumed by the very bitterness the tithe had created, burst inside with a heavy axe raised. He saw the Duke on his knees and the girl at the piano, bathed in a celestial glow. "Die, time thief," the assassin roared, lunging toward Alaric. Alara didn't stop playing, but she shifted the melody. She struck a dissonant, powerful chord that sent a shockwave of sound through the room. The vibrations were so intense that the assassin's axe shattered in his hands, the metal shards falling harmlessly into the dust. The man fell back, blinded by the radiance of the returning time. The obsidian ring on Alara's finger shattered, the stone dissolving into a fine mist that settled over her hands. As it did, the stiffness in her joints vanished. Her fingers became supple, her touch more precise than it had ever been. She was being healed by the very resonance she was creating. The golden light in the room reached a crescendo, swirling into a vortex that burst through the ceiling, shooting a pillar of radiance into the midnight sky. Across the kingdom, the tithe reversed. The elderly felt their phantom aches vanish. The young felt a surge of natural energy. The years were returning home. Alaric slumped against the piano, breathing heavily. He looked up at Alara, and she saw a different man. He looked to be in his early 40s now, still handsome, but with the dignity of age and the gravity of a life truly begun. The predator was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he had finally earned his rest. "It's done," Alaric whispered, his voice now a warm, tired baritone. "The hourglass is broken." But as the light faded, a new sound filled the air. Not the boots of soldiers or the shouts of zealots, but the tolling of the great cathedral bell. It wasn't a funeral toll. It was the rhythmic, steady beat of a clock that was finally, for the first time in a century, telling the truth. The cathedral bells continued to chime, a steady pulse of truth that echoed through the stone walls of the hidden music room. The assassins of the order had fallen to their knees, not in defeat, but in a strange, overwhelming peace. The bitter rage that had fueled their crusade had evaporated the moment the stolen years returned to their families. The room was silent now, save for the settling of dust and the ragged, honest breathing of a man who was finally mortal. Alaric Thorne reached out, his hand, now marked with the fine lines of a man in his 4th decade, resting on Alara's ivory gown. He looked up at her, his flint-gray eyes no longer cold or predatory, but filled with a profound, shimmering gratitude. "You saved them," he whispered, the silver in his hair catching the soft moonlight. "You saved me from a life that wasn't mine to keep." Alara stood, her own hands moving with a grace she hadn't felt since she was a child. The gnarled stiffness was gone, replaced by the fluid strength of a true master. She didn't see a duke or a thief before her. She saw Alaric, the man who had chosen to wither so his people could bloom. She reached down, her fingers brushing the new lines on his forehead, a gesture of tenderness that would have been impossible an hour ago. "We saved each other," she replied softly. "The music only works if the heart is willing to listen." They emerged from the secret passage into the grand ballroom. It was no longer a tomb of marble and stolen light. The golden chandeliers glowed with a natural, flickering warmth. The nobles and servants stood together, eyes wide with tears as they realized the phantom weight on their souls had lifted. When Alaric stepped into the light, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. He was older, grayer, and more weary, but as he stood tall, his authority came from a place of newfound integrity. He didn't return to his throne. Instead, he walked to the center of the floor and held out his hand to Alara. "The kingdom has had enough of clocks and hourglasses," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Tonight, we simply live." As Alara took his hand, the court orchestra, musicians who had regained their strength and their joy, began to play. It was a waltz, slow and sweeping, a melody that celebrated the beauty of a single, fleeting moment. Alaric led her in a dance that felt like the first true movement of his life. They spun beneath the golden light, the tattered hem of her ivory gown swirling against the polished floor. The guests began to join them, lords dancing with maids, guards with ladies, the barriers of status dissolving in the shared miracle of their returned lives. The grand piano stood in the background, a silent witness to the triumph of the soul over the theft of time. In the final, breathtaking image of the night, Alaric pulled Alara close, his forehead resting against hers. The kingdom was no longer a dying land ruled by a youthful ghost. It was a place of hope, where every wrinkle was a badge of a year well spent, and every heartbeat was a gift that belonged to the one who felt it. The phoenix had truly risen, not from flames, but from the harmony of two hearts that had dared to break the clock. The end. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. Thanks.